There are passageways beneath our feet that were sealed off on purpose, welded shut, bricked over, drowned in concrete. Not to keep people out, to keep whatever's down there in. Tonight, 3 people found those sealed passages, and they opened them anyway. Welcome to True Terraphiles Official. Most people never think about what's underneath them. Subway tunnels, utility corridors, old drainage systems, they're just there, humming away in the dark, doing their job. But every so often, someone stumbles onto a passage that wasn't meant to be found. A door where no door should be. A rusted hatch half buried in concrete. A brick archway hidden behind a false wall. Tonight, you'll hear from 3 different people who found these forgotten places and made the mistake of stepping inside. We're going to a decommissioned missile silo in Montana, Victorian Reservoir beneath Liverpool, and a sealed canal tunnel under Paris. Their names have been changed. Their fear doesn't need to be. If you ever find a door underground that looks like it's been sealed for decades, maybe don't open it. Let's begin. Tanner Eldridge spent his weekends documenting abandoned Cold War infrastructure in the decommissioned Atlas F missile silo complex outside Denton, Montana. Had been on his list for 2 years, 12 interconnected underground chambers, sealed by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1965, after the site was decommissioned. The entrance shafts capped with 6-foot-thick concrete plugs and marked with federal trespassing warnings that had long since rusted illegible. He'd done his research, obtained the original floor plans from a declassified Strategic Air Command archive, and knew exactly where the secondary access tunnel was supposed to be. A maintenance hatch concealed beneath a collapsed Quonset hut at the northwest corner of the compound. When he finally drove out there on a dry October morning, he found the Quonset hut's corrugated roof collapsed inward, the hatch beneath it still intact, circular steel lid with a recessed wheel lock, the metal pitted with corrosion but still functional. He'd brought a breaker bar for exactly this. The wheel screamed as he turned it, rust flaking onto his gloves, and when he heaved the hatch open, the air that rushed out was shockingly cold, a dry chemical cold that tasted like burnt metal and old ozone. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a ladder descending 50 feet into a concrete chamber that the floor plans identified as the old communications room. He climbed down. The room was exactly what he expected. Gutted consoles, stripped cable trays, gang graffiti from kids who'd found their way in during the 80s. But at the far end of the room, the plans showed a blast door leading to the main launch control corridor, and that door was sealed not with concrete, not with welded steel, but with heavy chains wrapped through the locking lugs and secured with a padlock that looked brand new. Tanner stared at that lock for a long minute. The floor plan said this entire complex was emptied and sealed in '65. Nobody should have been down here to put a new lock on anything. He took photos, checked the lock's brand master, same model you could buy at any hardware store, and that's when he heard it, a sound from behind the door. A steady, mechanical click-click pause. Click-click pause. Like a Geiger counter or an old teletype machine still cycling through a dead circuit. He pressed his ear to the cold steel. The clicking stopped. Then, distinctly, a single word filtered through the blast door, spoken by a voice that sounded entirely too calm, too measured, like a recording from a civil defense broadcast. Identified. Tanner didn't wait to find out what that meant. He scrambled up the ladder, slipped on the rungs twice, threw himself through the hatch, and didn't stop until he was back at his truck with the doors locked and the engine running. He drove all the way to Billings before he calmed down enough to check his photos. Every image he'd taken inside the communications room was normal except the last one, the shot of the chained blast door. In the photo, visible through the narrow gap between the door and the frame, two pale smears of light hovered at what would be eye level for an average adult. They weren't reflections. They weren't lens flare. They were looking directly at the camera. Tanner never went back. A year later, he found a declassified internal memo from the Army Corps dated 1967, 2 years after the complex was supposedly abandoned, requesting containment verification for Silo 1 to C Denton, and noting that the site had been resealed following a security incident involving missing maintenance personnel. The memo recommended against further entry. Nadine Chehan was a drainage engineer with United Utilities, and she'd been called out on a routine inspection of an overflow culvert beneath the Toxteth Park area of Liverpool, after residents reported a persistent smell of standing water and what one elderly tenant described as a humming, like a choir holding one note forever. The culvert access was behind a derelict Victorian pumping station on Grafton Street. And when Nadine and her apprentice Keir unlocked the maintenance hatch, they found that the culvert didn't end where the city schematics said it did. Instead, a section of the brick wall at the 50-meter mark had collapsed inward, exposing a much older tunnel beyond curved ceiling. Hand-laid engineering brick, the mortar crumbling but still holding, Nadine recognized the construction style immediately. This was part of the Toxteth Reservoir, a massive underground cistern built in 1854 to supply fresh water to Liverpool's expanding docklands. Decommissioned in 1924, supposedly drained and backfilled. Supposedly, she shone her torch into the gap. The old reservoir wasn't backfilled at all. The beam caught a cathedral of brick columns stretching away into blackness, each column rising from what had once been the reservoir floor, but was now a tangle of silt, rusted pipework, and stagnant black water reflecting the light like polished obsidian. Nadine told Keir to wait at the breach point. She stepped through. Her waders sank into cold muck, and the smell hit her not just stagnant water, but something organic beneath it. Damp wool and turned meat and the faint, sickly sweetness of decomposition that had been going on so long it had nearly run its course. She waded deeper, navigating around fallen columns, her torch picking out graffiti from 1890s workmen, dates and names scratched into the brick. Then she saw the far wall. The columns ended in a semicircular alcove that had been bricked off a dead end, structure complete, but the brickwork was wrong. It was rougher, newer than the Victorian originals, maybe 1920s, and in the center, at water level, was a sealed archway. The mortar was crumbling at the edges. Something had been trying to push through from the other side. Nadine froze. The water around her ankles was moving, not flowing from the breach, but pulsing gently. Like a slow heartbeat transmitted through the stagnant pool. And then she heard the humming. Low at first, a vibration she felt in her fillings before her ears caught it, slowly resolving into what the old tenant had described. A choir, its many voices, all holding the same note. A resonant B-flat that filled the reservoir chamber until the brickwork itself seemed to vibrate. The voices were coming from behind the sealed arch. Nadine took one step back. The humming stopped. A single voice, a man's voice, old and wet, spoke from the other side of the bricks with perfect clarity. Is it 1941 yet? Have they stopped the bombs? We're ready to come out now. 1941 was the year the Liverpool Blitz was at its worst, the year the docks burned for a week, the year this reservoir had been sealed. Nadine didn't remember getting out. Keir said she came stumbling through the breach, white as paper, grabbed his collar, and dragged him back through the culvert without a word. She filed a report recommending immediate resealing of the breach with reinforced concrete and refused to discuss the incident further. But she did, months later, look up the records for the Toxteth Reservoir's final days. In April 1924, the city council had sealed the reservoir after a structural engineer reported unusual settling and recommended against drainage, citing cost. The water was never pumped out. It was just left there. And Nadine has never been able to shake the question. How many people do you have to seal inside a reservoir, alive for them to still be humming a century later? Diego Castellano was a cataphile, Parisian urban explorer who'd been mapping the city's illegal underground networks for 15 years. The limestone quarries and ossuary offshoots and forgotten Napoleonic escape tunnels that laced the earth beneath the streets. He'd seen bones, he'd seen graffiti from the Revolution, he'd seen underground raves and mushroom farms and rooms full of unexploded World War II ordnance. But he'd never heard of the Canal des Morts until a fellow explorer named Jules showed him a sketch dated 1862, depicting a narrow, navigable waterway branching off the Biavre River's subterranean course and ending somewhere beneath the Montparnasse Cemetery. The sketch's margin contained a single handwritten notation: "Ne pas entrer, I else respirant encore." Do not enter, they still breathe. Diego and Jules found the entrance 3 weeks later. After tracing the Biavre-esque Captover course through the 14th arrondissement to a maintenance, grate behind the Denfert Trochereau catacomb entrance, the grate was loose. Beyond it, a stone staircase spiraled down into a brick canal tunnel, maybe 8 feet wide. Water black as ink, a narrow stone walkway running along one side. The air was damp and cold and carried a smell that Diego, who had spent half his life underground, had never encountered: the clean, preservative tang of embalming fluid, cut with something animal and ancient. They followed the walkway for 200 meters. The walls were covered in carvings, not graffiti, but rows upon rows of hash marks, too regular to be random, thousands of them, stretching from floor to vaulted ceiling. Diego ran his gloved hand over them, but they weren't chiseled. They were scratched directly into the stone with something sharp. Fingernails? Bone? The walkway ended at a chamber where the canal widened into a circular pool, the ceiling opening into a dome that disappeared into darkness. In the center of the pool, an island of mounded brick rose above the waterline. Jules trained his torch on it. The mound wasn't brick. It was a pile of clothing, Victorian funeral clothes. Rotted wool coats and stiffened collars and women's bonnets, mounted 6 feet high and draped over something lumpy and pale that shifted slightly in the beam of the torch. The pile was breathing. A slow, synchronized rise and fall like a sleeping body. Diego and Jules didn't speak. They didn't have to. They both turned at the same moment to go back the way they'd come. And that's when the water in the canal began to ripple, not with current, but with wake. As if something large was rising from the bottom of the pool behind them. They ran. Halfway down the walkway, Diego glanced back. Through the archway into the chamber, he saw that the clothing pile had stirred. Something was sitting up inside it, a shape too tall and too thin, wrapped in burial shrouds. And from its skull-less skull, he could see clearly, bare bone gleaming wet. In the torchlight a voice emerged, dry as dust, speaking French that sounded like it came from a throat that hadn't touched air in 200 years. Nous sommes les gardiens. Vous avez revile, les dormeurs. We are the guardians. You have woken the sleepers. Diego made the ladder. Climbed, didn't stop until he was on the street. Jules was behind him. They didn't talk for a week. When Jules finally did research, he discovered that the Canal des Morts wasn't on any official map because it had never been a canal at all during the 1780s, when the overflowing Parisian cemeteries were being emptied into the catacombs. The city had used that underground waterway to transport the bones of millions, floating them in barges through the dark to their new resting place. The workers who pulled those barges had a superstition that the dead never truly left their bones, that something remained tethered to them, and that if you weren't careful, you might wake it. They called the tunnel the Canal qui respire, the canal that breathes. Diego hasn't gone underground since. Sometimes, when he's lying in bed on still nights, he swears he can feel a vibration through the floor of his apartment, distant, subterranean-like, something inhaling. 3 sealed places that should have stayed sealed. A missile silo in Montana that was locked from the outside, but something was still cycling circuits behind the door. A Victorian reservoir in Liverpool where the water was never drained and the people inside never left. A bone canal beneath Paris where the dead were transported, and something woke up when 2 explorers walked in. Tanner, Nadine, and Diego all learned the same lesson. When someone goes to the trouble of sealing a door underground, they're not always trying to keep you out. Sometimes they're trying to keep something in. You've been watching True Terror Files Official? If these stories stayed with you tonight, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next collection. I read the comments and I want to know, have you ever found a sealed door or a hidden hatch somewhere it shouldn't have been? Did you open it? Tell me what happened. Until next time, remember, the deepest shadows aren't in the woods or the attic. They're right beneath your feet.